In our study of the messages that are found in the book of Acts, Paul and Barnabas have traveled deeper into the heart of Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, and they've arrived at a town called Lystra. They're kind of on the run. They had last been in Iconium, and they'd been chased out of there by the people. And so they come to Lystra, and we're told in verse 7 that there they continue to preach the gospel. And that's what we want to talk about, but it's important to understand something about Lystra because of the things that happened there. The Roman poet Ovid, who lived a little bit before the time of Christ, told the legend that in this area of Phrygia, Zeus, who was considered the chief of the gods, and Hermes, who was the messenger of the gods, had visited this area. And they had been denied lodgings by the local people. And so eventually, an elderly man and his wife welcomed them into their humble dwelling. And the gods rewarded that couple's hospitality by granting their request that their house become a temple to them, and appointing the man and the woman as priests within the temple. And then the gods punished the rest of the people in that town by destroying them all. And so that's a little bit of the context that we need for this message. We're going to start reading in verse 8. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and never walked, and he listened to Paul speaking. And Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed into the crowd, crying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. We're going to stop there. I think it's interesting that as Paul is teaching, this man is listening, and Paul pays attention to him, right? He notices and can tell that the man has faith. The healing of the lame man leads the crowds that are around to realize that something special has happened, right? And of course, that's part of the point of the miracles and the reasons that the miracles happen. Paul actually talked about this in the letter of 1 Corinthians, the 2nd chapter, talking about when he came to Corinth. And he said, "I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And he said, "I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, and my speech and my message were not plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of power, of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." Miracles do that, don't they? They remind us that this is not just Paul giving a message, but it is an expression of the Spirit and of the power of God in that place and at that time. But it's not surprising, is it, that the people equated the healing of this lame man with the power of their gods. They're aware that he had been crippled from birth and now he's walking and he springs up. And of course, that's beyond the power of just men to do. So this must be their gods. These are the gods they knew. It's the miracles that they thought would happen. And they said, look, the gods have come down in the likeness of men, which is common for their stories. Ovid just referred to that very specifically about this. And it's not surprising that the gods they chose, if the temple was in that area, were Zeus and Hermes, for those who they honored. They've come down and they're among us. Paul and Barnabas have to stop the people from thinking that way, though. They have to stop them from thinking that they are gods and from worshiping them. So we have the tearing of the garments, rushing into the crowd. And how brave is that, right? They rush into the crowds. Crowds can be crazy. And there they are, rushing in there, and they say, why are you doing these things? Why are they doing these things? I mean, this is what they had always done. This is how they worshiped. This is how they did things. They're going to try to do what they think is right to honor the gods who came down to be among them, aren't they? Just the very idea that the gods had come down to be among them is very interesting. I think it's special. It indicates that they at least conceived that gods would do that. Paul makes the point, down in verse 16 a little bit later, that in past generations, God had allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. And that's the ways that they were walking in at that moment. Of course, why had God allowed the other nations to walk in their own way? Well, he had chosen Abraham. And through Abraham was going to come eventually Jesus. And through Jesus, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So Israel is given this special relationship with God. They're given the law and the covenants and the promises. And they have that special role. But even though God allowed the nations to walk in their own ways, it doesn't mean that he stopped dealing with the other nations. Did he not give dreams to Pharaoh? Command Pharaoh Necho to go and attack the Syrians. He instructed Sennacherib about attacking Israel and Nebuchadnezzar to deal with Judah. And he sent dreams to Nebuchadnezzar also. So he allowed them to walk in their own ways, but he also tried to keep them following after him. Jonah, that's the one I wanted us to remember. Jonah was really important for that, wasn't it? I want you to repent. He didn't say that to Israel. He said that to the Ninevites. Yeah, Jonah hated it. But the message was there and it worked. And they turned to Jehovah for some time. But it's not the same as what God had with Israel, or what God was supposed to have with Israel if they had been faithful. They were God's chosen people, precious to him. And so God allowed the others to walk in their own ways. And so for them, offering up to Zeus and Hermes, that just made sense, right? Why are you doing these things? This is what we do. And Paul says in verse 15, we're here to bring you good news. He'd already been talking about it a little bit. We're not sure exactly what he said. But if you think about it, isn't that interesting? We're here to bring you good news, but didn't they feel like they already had some good news? A lame man was walking, right? That's good news. And here the gods have come down among us, and we're going to worship and sacrifice to them. What was better news than a miracle and the gods visiting them? They have good news. And Paul speaks about it very specifically. We bring you good news that you should turn away from these vain things. Ouch. So, what does Paul mean by vain things? A lot of us, when we hear the word vain, we go back to the book of Ecclesiastes and say it means empty or meaningless, and this isn't exactly that word. Okay? When Paul is talking about the things that are vain things in this case, of course he's referring to, contextually, Zeus and Hermes, right? Why are they vain? The word that's being used in this passage means something that is worthless because it's deceptive or ineffective. So these gods, Zeus and Hermes, are called vain things because they're useless and disappointing. You put your hope in them and it doesn't come to pass. The legend that Ovid told, we're not told how old it is, but even though he told it, probably wrote about it 50 years before this event, and calls it a legend, tells us it had been a long time since they had heard anything from Zeus and Hermes. They were useless and disappointing. Of course, isn't this exactly why Paul had been sent to the Gentiles? We read about this a couple of weeks ago in Acts, the 26th chapter, verse 17. God chose him to go to the Gentiles, he says, to open their eyes. Verse 18. To open their eyes. They needed their eyes open. So Paul has to use some pretty blunt language. Zeus and Hermes, they're vain. They're not doing for you what you think they should be doing. There's no reason to hope in them. Paul's commission was to open their eyes so that they could turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to the power of God. So by the vain things, he's talking about darkness and the power of Satan. And he needs them to open their eyes to something so much better, light and the true God. And in doing that, what does he offer? Forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified. So he needed to open their eyes. Paul later in Romans 1, you recall, he talks about how people had in their foolish hearts were darkened and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. And the images were images of mortal man, which Zeus and Hermes certainly fit, but also birds and animals and creeping things. But he also makes the point that these are from the art and the imagination of man. They come from our minds. That's why they're ineffective and useless, is because they're not real. So he needs to open their eyes. Let's go to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 10. In Jeremiah chapter 10, Jeremiah is trying to get the people of Israel to turn away from the idolatry of the nations that they see around them. And I think he has some interesting things that help us understand the problem and understand why these are vain things. So, beginning in verse 2, thus says Jehovah, Jeremiah 10, verse 2, thus says Jehovah, learn not the way of the nations, nor be dismayed at the signs of the heavens, because the nations are dismayed at them. For the customs of the peoples are vanity. A tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands, of a craftsman. He looks specifically at what's happening with the nations. And he says, just because there are signs in the heavens, don't be dismayed. Don't be afraid. Don't be terrified by these things. And this is very much the conclusion many scholars have come to about why people worship gods, is because they saw signs in the heavens or things on the earth, things like that. The volcano is erupting and destroying our village. Here comes the lava. What do? Well, let's give the god of the volcano a cow. And maybe that will appease that god and the lava will go the other way. And if the village is saved, we keep offering, right? Let's not let this happen again. Don't be dismayed, he says, by the things that happen, because the nations are dismayed by them. They didn't understand it. The customs of the people are vanity. And that's what was happening with Hermes and Zeus. Look down in verse 5. He says, their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. I like that description, don't you? Scarecrows in a cucumber field. You know, they're hanging out there. They really don't do anything. Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. They cannot speak. They have to be carried, for they cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither is it in them to do good. They're just scarecrows in the field. They're just something that you look to and hope that it has some influence, right? They can't do anything. And the way that he specifies that is they can't do evil and they can't do good. Please keep that in mind. Verse 11, he goes on to say, thus you shall say to them, the gods who did not make the heavens and the earth shall perish from the earth and from under the heavens. They didn't make it, and they're going to be gone. Verses 14 and 15. Every man is stupid and without knowledge. Every goldsmith is put to shame by his idols, for his images are false, and there is no breath in them. They are worthless, a work of delusion. At the time of their punishment, they shall perish. And I think that really gets us to the point. The images are false, right? They are just delusion. And that's what the people are giving into. And Paul, interestingly enough, doesn't give them a big lecture from Jeremiah. Did Paul know Jeremiah? I assume being, at the feet of Gamaliel, he could have quoted Jeremiah pretty well about the idols. He doesn't do that. Go back to our text, if you would. What are our vain things? What are our vain things? What are my vain things? Did you notice the things that he talked about, that we are dismayed by these? And he says, don't be afraid because they can't do evil or good. He said in verse 12, they have no power to create. They have no wisdom to create. And they're a delusion in verse 15. What is it that we fear? What is it that dismays us? What do we think has power to help us or to save us that's really a delusion? What is my delusion? What is it in our lives that can't accomplish the purpose that I hope for it, and so I end up being disappointed and longing for more? Now, for most of us, we've been conditioned really well by preachers at this point. What are we thinking of? Covetousness is idolatry, Colossians, right? Paul says that. We're probably thinking, and not incorrectly, that for a lot of people, the gods that they talk about are money and fame and societal status and work and things like that. But I want us to consider this maybe a little bit more deeper than that. Consider how we have actually created God in our own image by failing to think of him correctly. And even with the scriptures that we can read, we can come to conclusions about God that are vain also. We take bits and pieces of things that we read, and we choose the ones that we really like, and we decide, that's my God. And we don't have the full picture. So for some people, God becomes a God of wrath and destruction, and so we fear him. Do we need to turn away from that vain God? Yes. For some people, God becomes a God of love, which is true, but it's love as we define it usually. Do we need to turn away from that vain God? Absolutely. because those are all part of who God is. And our concept of God has to meet what is presented to us, not just what we like. Perhaps like the people in Lystra, what's worthy of our consideration, though, is what are the things that we substitute for God religiously? What are the religious things that we do that we substitute? The Israelites fell into this trap. If you look in Isaiah, the first chapter, you can read about how they offered, and God said, I will not accept your vain offerings. And it was because of their own sinfulness. And the things that he mentions are incense, the new moon, the Sabbath, and convocations. How many of those are authorized by God? All of them. The incense, the new moons, the Sabbath, they're all part of the old law. They were all given to them for their good. They were not wrong in and of themselves, but the people had made them wrong by how they treated them. Jesus warns us in Matthew, the 6th chapter, about the empty phrases that the Gentiles used in their prayers. Their prayers had actually become a vain thing. Jesus spoke of the Pharisees and the fact, this is in Matthew 15, of making their own commandments into the doctrine of God. They made their own commandments? Yes. And they thought they were very right about it. But they were vain things. There are times when we are worshiping Jehovah in name only, and we do it with vain worship, worshiping vain things. When the people offered incense, what were they doing? The Hebrew people, when they were offering incense, what was that for? It was a representative of prayers that were offered up to God. Can prayers become our God? Little g. Singing can become our God. Bible reading can become our God. Going to church can become our God. Evangelism can become our God. Unspoken rules and expectations can become our God. Gods, I guess. We fear them. We ascribe power to them. We measure our own faithfulness by our gods. And often we measure the faithfulness of others by our gods. The things that I just talked about, except for the unspoken expectations, all of those were commanded by God. They're not wrong in yourself. You and I should be praying and Bible reading and singing and coming to church and doing all the good things, but any of those can become our gods. It's we who make them into vain things. Have you made something into your God? And if you have, what have you exchanged for the true God? Open your eyes. Because this is not a message that's supposed to fill us with dread. It's supposed to open our eyes so we can see the light. So we can see the true God and turn and follow Him. This is a message of good news. And I said it almost morbidly, didn't I? But it's good news that we can turn from these things. Open your eyes and see there the living God. The good news of that living God, who in verse 15 talks about how He is the one who is living. He's not made out of stone or wood or man's imagination. It talks about Him as being the creator who made the heavens and the earth. And I like the reference back to Jeremiah 10 where he said, those who didn't make the heavens and the earth are gone. He allowed the nations to walk in their own ways. I could just see some of the people going, if this living God is so important, why didn't we know about it? What once God tolerated with the worship of Zeus and Hermes and others, never approved by God, but those things, God let the nations walk in their own ways. But what they attributed to those gods really came from God, didn't it? And I think that's what's really important about the passage, that as Paul gets down to this, is it says, but God did good. He didn't leave himself without witness. He did good. Remember in Jeremiah 10 what it talks about the idols? They can't do evil, so you don't need to be afraid. He also said they can't do good. And now Paul is making that reference here. God did good for all these people of Lystra. With the Jewish audiences, when Paul was talking, he would fill the messages with quotes back to the prophecies, right, and the things that the apostles had done. And although these people, they're not aware of God, he's saying they could have been. God had still provided enough information to them that they could know that he is the living God who created the heavens and the earth. And Paul made that point in the book of Romans, didn't he? In Romans, the first chapter, verses 19 and 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his, what are they? His eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have made. So he says, so they're without excuse. You can't know everything by going out at night and looking at the stars. I encourage you to do that. I love doing it. You can't know everything about God by looking at the Oregon Mountains. Did you see that sunset the other day? You can see that there is a God who is not man, but is deity. And you can see power there. So they're without excuse. But Paul doesn't even bring that up. He tells them you need to turn from these vain things, but he doesn't slam them about it. He says, God did good. He showed you all along. He did good. So often our concept of gods is what we talked about earlier, about God being wrathful, gods being wrathful and vengeance and capricious. Gods must be appeased, otherwise will be destroyed in punishment. Gods are presented to us as men are beneath God, I guess is the way I should say that. Men are beneath God, that we're just playthings to them. Of course, that's all part of the legend, isn't it? That these people knew. They came to town, the people weren't nice, destroy the whole thing. That's what they were used to. If Zeus and Hermes come again, are you going to be nice to them? Are you going to show hospitality? You are, but it's because you're maybe a little bit afraid that if you don't, what's going to happen? But God did good. And he says he did good the whole time. God does good to them. He sent rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. And he satisfied their hearts with food and gladness. And I think that's a really beautiful description of what God has done for everyone. Even the people who have ascribed everything that God has done to their vain things, here he is giving them food. And their hearts are satisfied, and they have gladness, and they're full. God does good things, and that's his witness. Look, that not only demonstrates the power and the reality of God, but more importantly, it shows us the character of this God. A God who cares for mankind, even those who don't honor him. He still cared not just about their existence, but about their heart and having a good life. God did good. The idols, Jeremiah 10, he said they can't do evil and they can't do good. God's witness is, I've done good all this time. At this point, Paul doesn't get to talk about Jesus. It says, scarcely saying these things, they had to restrain. They barely restrained them from offering sacrifices. I'm not sure exactly how Paul would have ended, but we're going to end by going to something like Ephesians 2, 1 through 10, which would tell us about Jesus. And these are still the words of Paul that remind us of who he is. And I think they're fitting for the town of Lystra. And you were dead in the trespasses and the sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and the kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Jesus Christ for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. The story of Jesus is about God being rich in mercy and grace, and we're saved by that. And will you have faith? The psalmist said to God, "Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things and give me life in your ways." Open your eyes, look at your life, see if there's vain things. If there are, turn away to the light and to God and to Jesus and find their life. If you believe today, you want to make God happy, to rejoice. If you want to rejoice also, everything's ready. I bet the water's freezing, but we can crack the ice if it's needed. And if you believe and you're ready to be baptized, we're ready to help you with that. Or if you need our prayers and help, please come forward as we stand and sing.